On May 14th, 1845, Dr. Samuel Harrington, a respected physician from New Orleans, arrived at a Louisiana plantation, expecting a routine delivery for a wealthy family. Instead, he discovered a disturbing truth. The young woman in labor was barely 20, already carrying her fourth child in 5 years, each one fathered by a different enslaved man, handpicked by her own father. She was not the only one. Her two sisters, locked away in separate rooms of the same mansion, were trapped in identical circumstances. When Harrington demanded an explanation, Colonel Thaddeus Crane revealed something far more sinister. He showed the doctor leather-bound ledgers filled with records spanning 3 generations, charts, caliper measurements, and genealogies, meticulously documenting the controlled breeding of his own bloodline with that of his slaves. He called it his legacy, his daughters patriots, and their children the future of the South. The greatest horror came when Harrington realized the colonel's daughters were not his biological children at all, but products of his father's twisted experiments decades earlier. Harrington's visit to Bellevue Plantation would force him to confront a terrible choice: reveal the truth and risk his life, or stay silent to preserve his career. By 1845, Harrington had built a name in New Orleans, treating both wealthy merchants in the French Quarter and poor immigrants along the docks. At 42, he had delivered countless babies, patched up broken bones, and fought disease during the deadly yellow fever epidemic of 1841. Hardened by years of suffering around him, he thought himself a man of science above all else. Yet he secretly carried sympathies for the American Anti-Slavery Society, a fact he guarded carefully. Attending only 2 quiet meetings during his medical training in Philadelphia, he had learned that in New Orleans, even a whisper of abolitionist ties could destroy a practice, or worse. He had long told himself that offering the same care to enslaved people as to their masters was the most he could do. 2 days earlier, a letter in elegant script had summoned him to Bellevue. Signed by Colonel Thaddeus Crane, it promised an extraordinary fee, triple his usual rate, and demanded absolute discretion. Harrington knew the Crane family's reputation, old Louisiana wealth with French colonial roots, though Thaddeus himself was an Englishman who had married into the family decades earlier. Bellevue lay 40 miles upriver, reachable only by boat or a long horseback ride through treacherous swamp roads. Harrington chose the riverboat, a small paddle steamer that made weekly supply runs to plantations. For 6 humid hours, he read medical journals while sweat clung to his shirt. Around him, merchants, overseers, and a Methodist minister shared the cramped deck, the minister eyeing him with suspicion, as men of faith often did with physicians. As the boat curved along the river, the plantation came into view. Its 3-story mansion gleaming white in the fading sun, framed by moss-draped live oaks that arched like a tunnel of shadow from the water's edge. Behind the mansion, Harrington caught sight of the long rows of slave cabins, 40 or 50 of them, standing in grim order, and beyond that, endless sugar-cane fields shimmering under the Louisiana sun. At the dock, a young house servant no older than 20 waited for him, neatly dressed in clean clothes that marked his position. Without a word, the servant took Harrington's medical bag and led him up the shell-covered path toward the house. The silence struck the doctor immediately. Plantations were rarely this still. There should have been the hum of voices, the shouts of overseers, the rhythm of labor drifting from the fields. Instead, there was only the hum of insects and the occasional lonely call of some unseen bird. The front door opened before they reached it. A woman stood framed in the doorway, her black silk dress severe against the sticky heat. She looked to be around 50. Her expression carefully composed her face, the kind that had long ago been trained to conceal true emotion. "Dr. Harrington," she said, in a refined New Orleans accent. "I am Constance Crane. Thank you for coming so quickly." She did not extend her hand. "My husband is waiting in his study." "You'll be shown to your room after. I trust the journey wasn't too taxing. Her words were polite but hollow rehearsed. Harrington's trained eye caught the fear beneath her composure. The journey was fine, Mrs. Crane, he replied. Your letter mentioned a difficult delivery. Something flickered across her face at the mention too quick to grasp. My husband will explain everything, she said, then turned and led him through the cavernous hall. Oil portraits stared down from the walls. Stern faces of men and women going back generations, each name engraved on brass plaques beneath the frame. The air smelled of beeswax and polished wood, with a faint medicinal trace that unsettled Harrington. Laudanum, perhaps, or some other tincture. She stopped before a large oak door and opened it. Colonel Thaddeus Crane's study filled the east wing of the house lined floor to ceiling with shelves heavy with leather-bound books. At the center sat a massive desk littered with instruments, papers, and 3 thick ledgers stacked neatly on one another. Behind the desk stood the colonel, a tall, wiry man in his early 60s, silver hair combed straight back from a high brow. His pale blue eyes fixed on Harrington with unnerving intensity. Dr. Harrington, please sit. His voice carried the precise edges of educated English, softened only slightly by years in Louisiana. He gestured to the chair across from him. I appreciate your prompt response. What I am about to share requires not only your medical expertise, but your absolute discretion. Before we proceed, I must have your word as a gentleman that what we discuss remains within these walls. Harrington felt unease stir in his chest. Colonel Crane, I am bound by my oath as a physician to preserve patient confidentiality. But if what you intend to tell me involves harm to another person, I cannot promise silence. The colonel's smile was cold and humorless. Harm, doctor, is a matter of perspective. What some call harm, others call progress. What some call cruelty, others call necessity. He turned to the window, clasping his hands behind his back. Tell me, Dr. Harrington, what do you know of heredity, of the transmission of traits from parent to child? Harrington straightened. What any trained physician knows. Families often share certain characteristics: height, build, eye color, susceptibility to disease. The colonel nodded slowly. Precisely. And if such traits can be documented, why not controlled, selected for, enhanced, improved through careful planning? He turned sharply, pale eyes locking on the physician. For the past half-century, my family has been engaged in an experiment. Not with cattle, not with horses, but with people. Harrington felt the air in the room turn heavy, his stomach knotting as the colonel settled behind his desk and opened the top ledger. From where he sat, the doctor could see the pages filled with tight handwriting diagrams and sprawling genealogies. Even at a distance, the truth was undeniable. My father began this work in 1795. The colonel set his voice flat as an old ledger, and he became obsessed with a single question. Could the raw strength and endurance of African slaves be mixed with what he called white refinement to produce a superior human being, not a slave, but something new, stronger than any white man, smarter than any pure African, and utterly loyal to the families that made them? Harrington felt his mouth go dry. This was not medicine, it was something else entirely, a moral abyss. The colonel treated the comparison as practical, the same logic used to breed dogs or improve crops, and he described how his father spent decades selecting slave women for height symmetry and lack of scars, fathering children, taking monthly measurements, running cognitive tests, and temperament notes, all entered in tight script across page after page. The results, the colonel said, showed hybrid vigor, children who outperformed both parents, and even more alarmingly, the greatest gains showed up in second and third generations when the offspring were bred in planned combinations. Harrington stood and declared he would have no part of it, that he had come to deliver a child, not to be enlisted in grotesque science, and the colonel answered without flinching that money brought him here, and that refusal would mean he would not leave Bellevue alive. Sitting back down, heart racing, Harrington listened as the colonel shifted to a colder clinical tone and explained the supposed flaw in his father's work, treating people as property-bred resistance escape, even infanticide. So the solution was to change the method to make the women willing, by raising white daughters in isolation, educating and conditioning them until bearing those children was their sacred duty. The colonel flipped the ledger so Harrington could see the neat family trees, dates, measured traits, and a column labeled cognitive rating. And when Harrington recoiled at the idea of using his own children, the colonel only smiled and corrected him. These were his father's children, born from experiments begun generations before, and now the work would continue. The 3 young women in the East Wing were born out of my father's experiments, the colonel said. And my role has only been to carry that work forward, to raise them as a father would, and guide them toward their purpose. They call me father, and believe me. But in truth, they are my half-sisters, the daughters my father produced before he died. The meaning of that hit Harrington like a blow. You are breeding your own half-sisters. The colonel corrected him, clinical and calm. I am continuing vital research, and the results have outstripped my expectations. In the last 5 years, my daughters have produced 11 children, 9 of whom survived, and every stage of their growth is recorded with obsessive care. They are strong beyond typical white children, quick to learn, artistically inclined, and uncannily beautiful, he said. And crucially, they are mine, born and raised here on Bellevue, and taught to accept their place. In 10 years, when the eldest comes of age, I will have workers who can read, write, calculate, and carry out skilled labor, yet who will never question their role. Harrington felt sick. You have created a nightmare, he said, trapped women bearing children who will be raised as slaves even though they share your blood. The colonel snapped back that these were his father's blood, not his, and that the children were not slaves in the strictest sense. They would be freed at maturity, given papers, and a small sum allowed to work as free people of color. Some even light enough to pass as white and slip into positions no ordinary freed slave could reach. He spoke quietly of placing his granddaughters in respected families in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, raised as orphaned relatives or charity cases, unnoticed and unquestioned, and of a future where hundreds like them would live across the South in jobs of trust and power, but remain loyal to those who created them. Harrington asked why he had been summoned, and the colonel told him simply that his eldest daughter was 8 months along and her past labors had grown dangerous. He needed a skilled physician to keep mother and child alive. You come from New Orleans with no local ties. The colonel said, so you will deliver this child, tend my daughters, and never speak of what you have seen. In return, you will be handsomely paid and allowed to return to your practice, but refuse, and you will not leave Bellevue alive. Your disappearance blamed on the common accidents that swallow travelers in these swamps. The room held a long, heavy silence as Harrington weighed the choice pressed on him by that cold, relentless logic. Through the window, Harrington watched the sun slipping down the river, its glow turning the water into a ribbon of gold, a breathtaking view in the middle of a nightmare. Take me to the patient, he said at last, the words tasting bitter. The colonel's thin smile carried triumph. I knew you were a reasonable man, Dr. Harrington. Mrs. Crane will lead you to the East Wing. I will join you shortly. Walking behind Constance Crane through the hushed corridors, Harrington's mind churned. He needed a way to escape, to bring word of what was happening here. But first he had to survive. And before anything else, he needed proof that the colonel's twisted claims were not the fantasies of a diseased mind. The East Wing revealed itself as something between a hospital and a prison. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender water, overlaid with the sharp tang of antiseptic, the kind that reminded Harrington of New Orleans Charity Hospital. Whitewashed walls gleamed under the fading light doors, evenly spaced, each with a small curtained window. Constance's hand trembled as she paused at the first door. "This is Eliza," she whispered. "She is 22. This will be her 4th child." Harrington studied her face. "You know what is happening here," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Her jaw tightened, the faintest crack in her composure. "I know that I am the Colonel's wife, and my duty is to run his household. I know there are things in his work that haunt me. But saying them aloud would change nothing except to bind me deeper in guilt." Her eyes flickered to his. "I do what I can. I bring them books, music, small comforts. It is not enough, but it is something." She opened the door, and Harrington stepped into a room that struck him with its contradictions. Spacious, well-furnished, lit with the last of the day's sun pouring through tall windows. A 4-poster bed stood neatly made, shelves lined with books, watercolor paintings brightened the walls. But behind the lace curtains, faint but undeniable, the bars on the windows told the truth. In a cushioned chair by the window sat a young woman with a face so striking Harrington caught his breath. Her skin was warm honey, her features delicately symmetrical, her eyes wide and intelligent, but shadowed with fear. Thick, dark hair framed her face, and her hands rested protectively on her rounded stomach. "This is Eliza," Constance said gently. "Dr. Harrington has come from New Orleans to help with your delivery." Eliza rose carefully, her movements deliberate with the weight of late pregnancy. "Good evening, doctor," she said with a practiced grace. "I apologize for not standing more quickly. The baby has been restless." Her voice carried an educated cadence, as though shaped by reading rather than conversation. Harrington found his voice. "Please do not trouble yourself. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she admitted. "The last birth was difficult. I lost more blood than I should have, or so Mother Constance says. Father fears this time will be worse." She said it calmly, as though discussing a change in the weather. Harrington's chest tightened. "Father? You mean Colonel Crane?" "Of course," she said, puzzled. "Who else would I mean?" Constance excused herself, leaving Harrington alone with the young woman. For a moment, the silence pressed heavy between them. He had always prided himself on professional detachment, the ability to treat anyone with the same clinical care. But here that instinct faltered. "You may examine me, Doctor," Eliza said with quiet resignation. "I am used to it. Father has physicians come often. You are the third." She moved to the bed, lying back with the modest grace of someone who had performed this ritual before. Harrington opened his bag, with mechanical precision, taking out his stethoscope. He listened to the child's heartbeat, strong and steady, checked her pulse, noted her blood pressure. All the while his mind raced with questions he could not ask, truths he could not speak without shattering what little innocence she had been allowed to keep. The baby was healthy, but nothing in this room was. The baby's position was reassuring, head down and engaged, but Harrington's trained hands told him what his patient's calm face tried to hide. Eliza's pulse was too fast, her abdomen tense with stress. "The child seems strong," he said carefully, "but I am concerned about you. Are you resting?" She gave a faint smile, resigned. "As well as I can. The baby never sleeps at night, and I worry about what comes after." Harrington pressed gently. "What do you mean?" Eliza's dark eyes met his. "The children are taken away 6 weeks after birth. Father insists they must be raised together, like a flock, to form bonds. I understand the reasoning, but it is hard to let them go after carrying them for 9 months. Cold horror slid through Harrington. "You have given up 3 children already." 4, she corrected quietly. "The first was lost at 5 months. Father said such things are common. The second was a son, 3 years old now, strong and clever, Mother Constance tells me. The next two were girls 1 and 2 years old. This child will be my 5th. 5 pregnancies in 5 years. Anger rose in Harrington's throat. Miss Eliza, forgive me, but do you understand the circumstances of these pregnancies? Do you know who the fathers are? Her expression shifted into mild confusion, as if he had asked something obvious. Of course I know. Father explained everything when we came of age. We are part of a great work that will change the future of the South. The men are chosen for their strength, their beauty, their perfection. Our children will embody the best of both races. And you accept this? Harrington demanded. Why wouldn't I? She asked, genuinely perplexed. Father has given us education culture a purpose beyond ordinary women. We are not slaves, Doctor. We are participants in something greater than ourselves. Our children will be free with opportunities denied to both blacks and whites. Harrington's heart sank. The colonel had not only imprisoned these women in flesh and blood experiments, he had convinced them it was noble. Has anyone told you that you could choose otherwise? Harrington asked softly. That you could refuse. For the first time, her calm cracked. Refuse. What would I do? Where would I go? Father has given us everything. Without him, we are nothing. A knock shattered the moment. The colonel entered as if he owned the air in the room. Dr. Harrington, I trust the patient is well. Harrington forced his tone even. The child is healthy, but Miss Eliza is weakened. Another birth so soon is dangerous. The colonel waved off the concern. Noted. But the breeding schedule must continue. Once she recovers, she will be paired again. Eliza adjusted her dress and sat back down, untroubled by words that made Harrington's stomach twist. He forced his voice steady. If I am to oversee these deliveries, I must examine your other daughters as well. The colonel nodded. In time. But first, you must see what we have built. He led Harrington down the hall to a locked door. Producing a key, he opened it to reveal a staircase sinking into shadow. The nursery, he explained. Climate controlled away from the main house to ensure proper development. The basement was transformed into a world of small rooms, painted in sterile white, furnished with cribs, cots, toys, and shelves of primers. In the main room, 9 children ranging from newborns to perhaps 4 years old played or studied under the watchful eyes of 2 enslaved women. Harrington froze where he stood. The children were unlike any he had ever seen. Beautiful in a way that was unnatural. Every one of them carrying the same honey-colored skin, the same delicate symmetry, the same wide, intelligent eyes that mirrored their mother's. The older ones sat with books, reading sentences no child their age should understand. The colonel's breeding ledgers had been brought to life. A 3-year-old girl bent over a small chalkboard, working through arithmetic problems, while a 2-year-old boy built intricate towers from blocks with a skill that seemed far beyond his years. And Harrington stood frozen as the colonel watched with obvious pride and said, "This is what I have created. Superior specimens in every measurable way, stronger than white children, more intelligent than slave children, and utterly controllable because they know no other life." One of the older children, maybe 4, came forward and curtsied with perfect form, addressing the colonel as grandfather, and asking if he had come to test them, then returned to her play when he said, "Not today." "They call him grandfather," Harrington said, and the colonel corrected him, "They are my grandchildren, the daughters of my daughters, though the children will be taught a different story as they grow. That their mothers were distant relations who died in childbirth, a fiction to hide the truth and keep bloodlines pure." The room was full of managed laughter and carefully scheduled lessons, older children reading primers far beyond their age, younger ones guided through exercises designed to shape hands and minds. "How many plantations are part of this?" Harrington asked quietly, and the colonel smiled and said, "Currently 5, including Bellevue, with interest growing among men who see the future not in abolition, but in engineering a new class of people who will be legally free, yet raised to be loyal and dependent. 3 of the lightest granddaughters have already been placed in prominent families in New Orleans and Baton Rouge as orphaned relatives," the colonel said. "And when they marry, their children will be even lighter and more accepted, so that in a few generations, these bloodlines will infiltrate the aristocracy of the Gulf Coast." Harrington felt the room tilt. The colonel argued that slavery cannot last forever, and that this plan preserves the social order by creating workers who can read and calculate, and yet will never imagine another life. The idea was monstrous and chillingly plausible, and Harrington realized that if other planters adopted the method, it could reshape Southern society for generations. He told the colonel he needed to examine the other daughters if he was to manage their deliveries, and the colonel agreed, reminding him coldly that his role was physician, not judge. And as they climbed back to the main floor, Harrington's mind raced with plans to gather evidence and call authorities in New Orleans without getting himself killed, and the examinations that followed showed the same pattern of conditioned acceptance, measured health, and looming danger. Caroline was 20, already the mother of 2 and 4 months into her 3rd pregnancy. She carried herself with the same calm, rehearsed composure as Eliza, repeating the colonel's ideology as if it were scripture. Yet Harrington's practiced eye caught the truth in the flickers. She tried to hide the faint tremble of her hands before she clasped them tightly, the tension around her mouth when she spoke of her duty. Margaret, the youngest at 18, was less disciplined. Pregnant for the first time, she asked nervous questions about childbirth in a way that revealed both her innocence and her fear. She had been raised to believe her role was sacred, but her dread of the pain ahead was raw and unmasked. Harrington found himself soothing her, answering as a physician would, and loathed himself for it, knowing every reassurance only tightened the chains of obedience that bound her. By the time his examinations were complete, night had draped the plantation in silence. Constance Crane escorted him to a guest room on the 2nd floor, distant from the east wing. The chamber was furnished with a bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the darkened fields. Unlike the girls' quarters, the window was unbarred. He was not a prisoner, not exactly merely a guest who understood the consequences of leaving uninvited. Supper arrived on a tray carried by a silent slave girl who would not meet his gaze. The food was well prepared, roasted chicken with rice and vegetables, but Harrington could not taste it. His mind kept circling back to the 9 children in the basement nursery, to their bright eyes and perfect manners, to their future already charted like figures in a ledger. Escape crossed his mind. If he left under cover of darkness, he might reach the river, might flag down a passing boat. But he dismissed the thought almost as quickly. The colonel would anticipate it. Dogs, overseers, men stationed on the paths. Even if he did reach New Orleans, who would believe such a story without proof? No, he would need the ledgers. Those books were the key records of names, births, bloodlines, financial dealings, enough evidence to expose not only Colonel Crane, but the wider circle of planters already complicit. A soft knock pulled him from his thoughts. Harrington's pulse quickened. He half expected the colonel himself, but when he opened the door, it was Constance Crane, candle trembling in her hand. She slipped inside and shut the door quickly. In the wavering light, her face seemed older, more lined, the weight of years spent swallowing horror etched deep. "If you've come to ask me to keep silent," Harrington began, "I've come to help you expose him." She cut in sharply, voice low but steady, though her hands shook. "For 20 years I have been a coward. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that offering small comforts was enough. But it is not. You've seen what I have seen, and I cannot let it continue." Harrington felt the first stirrings of hope since his arrival. She told him of the duplicates, exact copies of the colonel's ledgers, locked in a safe within his study, containing not just the breeding records and genealogies, but also correspondence with other planters and financial accounts of the children placed into society. She pressed a small key into his palm. "This will open the safe. After my husband takes his laudanum tonight, I will unlock the study door. You'll have perhaps 20 minutes before the house stirs. Can you copy what matters?" Harrington nodded grimly. "I can try." At the door, she paused, candlelight flickering across her strained face. "There is something else," she whispered. "The girls are not his half-sisters." That is the story he tells himself, the story he writes in those ledgers. But I know the truth. I was married to his father. Those children, Eliza, Caroline, Margaret, they are his own. Born of slave women, he bedded in his youth. He tells himself they are his father's daughters, Constance had said. But they are not. They are his own. He has been breeding his own children since they reached 15. The words slammed into Harrington like a blow to the chest. All of the colonel's cold talk of inherited duty and scientific legacy was a lie, a grotesque mask to cover his own depravity. He wasn't carrying on a tradition he had invented. It justified it and wrapped himself in it like a shroud. "My God," Harrington whispered. "There is no God in this house." Constance answered, "Only monsters and their victims." She slipped out into the dark hallway, leaving him alone with the truth and the key in his pocket. The hours that followed dragged by in agony. Harrington lay fully dressed on the bed, his mind racing as shadows shifted across the ceiling. Every creak of the house, every distant sound made his pulse leap. At 10 minutes to 2, he rose and gathered what he needed, his bag paper pencils. He knew he could not carry out the ledgers in their entirety, but he could copy the most damning details: names, dates, bloodlines. Evidence. The hall was silent, except for the guttering flame of a single candle fixed to the wall. He crept to the study, his heart hammering. The door stood slightly ajar, as promised. He eased it open, stepping into pitch darkness. With his hands, he felt across the desk, searching for the weight of leather-bound books. Nothing. Only scattered papers and instruments. Panic flooded him. "Looking for these, Doctor?" The voice rose from the shadows. A match flared and the colonel's face bloomed into the lamplight. He sat in a chair, the ledgers stacked neatly on his lap, a pistol resting on the arm. "My wife is many things," he said smoothly, "but deceit has never been her strength. She was restless tonight, claimed a headache, and retired early. I suspected." The study seemed the logical place to wait. "Where is she?" Harrington forced out, locked in her chambers unharmed. "I do not brutalize my wife, Doctor. I am not a savage. But I will not allow her weakness to jeopardize my life's work." He set the ledgers aside, lifted the pistol, not aiming it, but letting its weight hang heavy in the air. "The question now is what to do with you. I had hoped for a professional arrangement. You tend my daughters, I pay you well, and we part as gentlemen. But it seems you insist on making this difficult. You cannot expect me to stay silent." Harrington said, his voice hard. "You are destroying your own children, creating slavery that will outlast slavery itself." The colonel's pale eyes gleamed. "I am ensuring the survival of a civilization, and you, Doctor, are about to become a regrettable casualty of your own righteousness." Before Harrington could move, heavy footsteps sounded in the hall. The door burst open. An overseer, scarred and broad-shouldered, spoke quickly. "Colonel, there's trouble. The eldest girl, she's in labor, bleeding bad. Eliza." For the first time, the colonel's calm cracked his mask, slipping to reveal real fear. How long, he demanded. An hour, maybe. The slave woman came running. The colonel was on his feet at once, the pistol left behind. "Dr. Harrington, your services are needed. We will resume this later." They rushed through the corridors to the east wing. The room was chaos. Eliza lay gray-faced on the bed, blood soaking the sheets, two enslaved women trying in vain to stem the torrent with cloths. Constance knelt at her side, gripping her hand, whispering steady words. Harrington shoved past them, instincts taking over. The baby was crowning, but the bleeding was catastrophic, a crimson tide spreading faster than any cloth could absorb. "Placental abruption," he snapped. "The placenta has torn away. If I don't deliver now, both will die." The next 20 minutes were consumed by battle. Harrington guided the child into the world, cleared its airways, rubbed its still chest, until at last a thin cry rose above the panic. A boy gasping, but alive. Relief flickered, but Eliza's body convulsed with continued bleeding. Harrington packed the womb, forced the uterus to contract with ergot, applied pressure with every technique he knew. His hands worked furiously, blood slick and warm under his fingers as Constance whispered prayers into Eliza's ear. The bleeding slowed, each minute a battle, until at last Harrington felt the danger recede. His hands and arms were slick with blood, his body trembling with fatigue, but Eliza still breathed pale and unconscious. The colonel's voice, stripped for once of arrogance, cut through the quiet. "She will live. Perhaps the next day will decide. But another pregnancy will kill her," noted the colonel said flatly before turning his cold attention to the infant. He studied the newborn with clinical detachment, pronouncing the boy strong and healthy, another successful specimen. Harrington's fury burned through his exhaustion. "That child nearly killed his mother," he said. "Your daughter almost died because of you." Yet the colonel only replied, "But she did not die. The work continues." In that moment, Harrington resolved he would not leave Bellevue without proof. He would find a way to expose this horror, even if it cost him everything. He stayed by Eliza's bedside, insisting her condition demanded constant monitoring. Constance remained as well, silent, hollow-eyed. The slave women were dismissed, leaving the room eerily quiet except for Eliza's shallow breaths and the distant wail of the newborn carried away to the nursery. Constance finally whispered, "I've made everything worse." Harrington told her she had shown courage. She shook her head. Courage would have been 20 years ago. Courage would have been refusing him from the start. She glanced at Eliza's still form. "Even if she survives, he will never stop." Harrington had no answer. At dawn, Eliza stirred her eyes, fluttering open. "Where is the baby?" she whispered. Harrington told her the child was safe, a healthy boy, and she would recover. Her expression shifted unreadable. Then she asked, "How long until I can have another?" The words nearly broke him. "Miss Eliza, you cannot. Another pregnancy will kill you." She turned her face away. "Then I am useless. I have failed Father's work." Harrington leaned forward, desperate. "You are a human being, not a vessel. You could leave this place, live your own life." But she only shook her head. "Where would I go? What would I do? I belong nowhere." Her words struck him harder than any wound. The colonel had caged not only her body, but her mind, her very capacity to imagine freedom. 3 days passed in uneasy silence. Eliza's condition stabilized, but Harrington was not permitted to leave. He observed more of the plantation's hidden machinery. The 9 children drilled daily in reading numbers and obedience, their joy carefully measured. Caroline and Margaret visited their sister under the colonel's watchful eye, chirping about their pregnancies and the honor of their sacred work. Yet Harrington saw the cracks. Caroline's restless hands betrayed nerves, and Margaret's questions were too innocent, too frightened. On the third night, the colonel summoned Harrington once more. The ledgers were locked away, the pistol absent. In their place sat a decanter of brandy and 2 glasses. "Sit, doctor," he said. "We must speak of your future." Harrington stayed on his feet. "I will not keep your secrets. What you are doing is monstrous. It must end." The colonel poured the brandy, calmly slid a glass across the desk. "And how will you stop me?" "You have no evidence. The ledgers are secure. Even if you run back to New Orleans with your tales, who will believe you? I am a respected man. You are a physician with known abolitionist leanings. Your word means little." Harrington fired back that the children were evidence. But the colonel only smiled. "They are my grandchildren, born of my daughters and selected slaves. Tragic, yes, but not unusual. Many planters father children with slaves. Society shrugs, and my daughters will swear it was their choice that they are treated well." "What crime will you prove?" The truth crushed Harrington. The colonel was right. Without the ledgers, without written proof of the calculated system, all he had was testimony drowned in the wider ocean of Southern hypocrisy. It was a trap designed not just with bars and walls, but with respectability, wealth, and silence. The colonel's tone was smooth, almost paternal, as he offered his bargain. "You have proven your worth, doctor. You saved Eliza's life. Years of careful breeding preserved. I am prepared to offer you a position as permanent physician, not just here, but to the entire network of facilities participating in our program. A salary beyond anything you've known. Cases that will advance medical knowledge. You would be part of something that will reshape Southern society. You want me to become complicit in your crimes?" Harrington said flatly. The colonel smiled. "I want you to be practical. Slavery exists, doctor. It will continue to exist. I am merely creating a more efficient, more humane system. Join us, and you can ensure the women and children are treated well within the constraints of the program." It was the classic devil's bargain. Accept and Harrington would gain wealth security and the small power to offer comfort to the victims at the cost of his soul. Refuse, and he would vanish into the swamps like so many before him. "I need time to consider," he said. "You have until tomorrow evening," the colonel replied, standing. "Until then, move about freely. Speak with whom you like. Perhaps understanding our work will help you make the right choice." That night, Harrington lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind a snarl of panic. He could not escape without evidence. He could not expose the conspiracy without proof. And he could not accept the colonel's offer without betraying everything he believed. There was no way out, until the soft scratch at his door jolted him upright. He opened it to find Clara, one of the nursery women, the older one with sharp, knowing eyes, who rarely spoke. "Doctor," she whispered urgently, "you need to come with me." She led him silently through the kitchen, across the dark grounds, under the drape of Spanish moss, to a small, half-hidden structure he hadn't noticed before. As they drew near, he realized it was a cemetery, overgrown, and neglected iron gates rusting in the damp air. Clara guided him to the back corner, where small headstones marked graves no longer than a child's arm. She knelt brushing weeds from an inscription. "Infant Crane died April 1834, aged 3 months. There are 17 buried here," she said quietly. "Babies born in the first years of the colonel's work, babies with defects or the wrong color skin or temperaments he judged unsuitable. He called them failures. Mistakes to be corrected." Harrington's stomach lurched. He killed his own grandchildren. Not all died naturally, Clara said. Some were smothered. Some were given medicine to still their hearts. I know because I was there. I helped bury them, and I have kept count of every single one. She reached into her apron and drew out a small book, its pages covered in cramped, careful handwriting. I have written down every birth, every death, every child that passed through this place for 15 years. Names, dates, descriptions, everything he records in his ledgers I have mirrored here. Why are you showing me this? Harrington asked, his voice low. Because you are the first person to come here who saw the truth and was horrified. Because I have been waiting 15 years for someone with the power to stop this. And because if you take his offer tomorrow, if you join him, there will be no hope left for any of us. She pressed the book into his hands. Take this. Get it to someone who can help. Someone who will believe you. I do not care what happens to me. I am an old woman. But those girls upstairs, those children in the basement, they deserve a chance at a different life. Harrington stared down at the little book. This was evidence. Real damning evidence. And the graves themselves were evidence too. 17 tiny bodies waiting to be exhumed. How do I get off this plantation alive? He whispered. There is a boat, Clara said. Every Thursday at dawn. It unloads for 2 hours, then moves upriver. If you can reach the dock and convince the captain to take you, you might escape before the colonel knows you're gone. He will know you spoke to me, Harrington said. He will punish you. Clara's face was calm, almost serene. I have lived too long with these secrets. What happens to me no longer matters. Clara smiled a terrible knowing smile and said she had been a slave for 63 years and wanted to do one good thing before she died so. At dawn, Harrington set out for the river with only his bag and Clara's little book tucked in a pocket. The plantation silent and heavy behind him as he moved past dark cabins and an empty overseer's shack toward the dock where a weathered paddle wheeler waited, and its captain, a man who had spent a lifetime on the river, agreed to take him for $5. After warning him that Bellevue had a bad reputation. Strange things and people who never returned, and as the boat shoveled away from the bank, Harrington let himself breathe for the first time, thinking he had escaped with the proof he needed. Reading Clara's pages on the 6-hour trip back to New Orleans made his relief curdle into dread. The journal detailing not just a dozen infant graves, but names, dates, methods of secret infanticide, and a roster of visitors from across the Delta. Plantation owners, a state senator, a federal judge, a banker, a conspiracy far larger than Crane had admitted. And when Harrington landed, he raced to the district attorney, only to find Whitfield out of town, and then to the police, where the chief regarded Clara's book as the worthless testimony of a slave, and warned that no judge would issue a warrant on such evidence, advising him to let it go. And then Judge Cartwright walked in without knocking. The same judge whose name Clara had recorded, visiting Bellevue, sat himself down with the cool authority of a man used to being obeyed and told Harrington that Crane had reported a theft, that papers written by a slave were inadmissible, and that the law would protect a man on his own estate even if children died, before offering Harrington a choice: return to his practice and forget everything he had seen, or persist and be ruined with charges of theft, trespass, and slander that would strip him of his license and bury his career. Clara smiled a terrible, steady smile and said she had been a slave for 63 years and wanted to do one good thing before she died. So at dawn, Harrington slipped out with only his medical bag and Clara's little book tucked inside his coat, crossed the silent quarters, and climbed down to the river, where a battered paddle wheeler waited, and a weathered captain agreed to take him for $5 after warning that Bellevue had a bad name. Strange things and people who never came back. And for a few hours, as the boat pushed up the river, Harrington thought he had escaped with proof in hand, only to find on closer reading that Clara S. notes were worse than he had imagined. A meticulous ledger of infant deaths, names, dates, and visitors from across the Delta, including planters. A state senator, a federal judge, and a banker, a conspiracy larger than the colonel had led on. And when he raced to the district attorney, Whitfield was out of town, and the police chief dismissed the journal as the useless testimony of a slave before Judge Cartwright himself appeared calm and polished and plainly invested in the same scheme, offering Harrington a choice to go home and forget or be ruined by charges of theft and slander. And in that hollow city of bought respectability, every avenue seemed blocked, every authority compromised, until Harrington remembered the only people who might act without caring about status. The abolitionists, the men and women who met secretly in a cramped bookstore on Chartres Street. And when he told them everything and laid Clara S. book on the table, a plan formed that was half desperate and half righteous. A small party would go to Bellevue, rescue the women and children, and try to seize the ledgers, while messengers sent the story north to abolitionist papers. And because he knew the Plantation layout and the schedule, Harrington agreed to lead the raid with a freedman named Marcus, who knew how to move people along the Underground Railroad, and 6 others, leaving 2 nights later from a riverbank 3 miles south in the humid, moonless, dark, moving single file through sugarcane, guided by Marcus's sure steps until the house rose ahead with only a few dim lights and an unnerving quiet that felt like a trap. But the kitchen door stood unlocked as promised, and they slipped inside. Soaked and silent, split into 2 groups, with Marcus and 4 heading for the east wing to free the women and children, while Harrington and 2 companions crept toward the study to get the ledgers, every step heavy with the knowledge that if this failed, there would be reprisals, and worse yet, they moved on, because doing nothing was no longer an option. The room went dead still. The only sounds were the hiss of the lamps and Eliza's soft, even breathing. Harrington watched the overseers exchange glances. Their rifles half lowered, their posture uncertain. They had been paid to enforce discipline, not to confront the house's mistress, standing upright and pale but unbroken, calling out her father in front of everyone. Eliza took another step into the study, her bare feet leaving faint smears of blood on the carpet. "I am not delirious," she said quietly. "I am finished." Her gaze swept the room, stopping on each overseer. "You have watched him do this for years. You know what happens to the babies who are not perfect. You know what he has done to me and my sisters. If you help him kill these people, you are no different than he is." For the first time, Harrington saw a crack in the colonel's command. He barked, "Seize her," but his voice broke. One overseer shifted his weight and lowered his rifle slightly. Another took a step back. Marcus, still kneeling and bleeding, caught Harrington's eye. The tension in the air felt like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. Eliza's voice rose steadier now, stronger with every word. "We are not his daughters. We are his victims, and the children below are not his property. They are innocent. Help us. Help us end this." Caroline appeared in the doorway, then Margaret just behind her, both in nightclothes, their faces pale but defiant. Caroline spoke first, her voice trembling but audible. "We are awake, Father." Margaret added, "We will not do this anymore." The colonel spun toward them, his pale eyes gone wild. "You dare," he started, but the overseer closest to him stepped between them, rifle in hand, but not aimed. "Sir," the man said carefully, "the girls need rest. The doctor needs to tend to them. Maybe this ain't the time." Something in the colonel snapped. He lunged for the pistol on his desk. Harrington moved on instinct. In the same heartbeat, Marcus surged to his feet, tackling the nearest overseer, knocking the rifle from his hands. The room exploded into chaos, shouts, bodies grappling the lamp, tipping and spilling oil across the carpet. Harrington dove for the ledgers on the desk, clutching them to his chest as the colonel swung the pistol up, his face twisted with fury. Eliza screamed. Caroline snatched up the fallen lamp and hurled it. The oil ignited as it struck the colonel's sleeve, flames racing up his arm. He dropped the pistol, batting at the fire, his scream rising above the din. Smoke filled the study. Marcus wrenched another rifle free and tossed it to one of his men. "Get the women out!" he shouted. Harrington staggered toward the door with the ledgers in his arms. Eliza clung to his shoulder, Caroline and Margaret behind her. Overseers scrambled to put out the fire or flee. The colonel, burning and shrieking, stumbled against the desk and crashed to the floor. The thick carpet smothered some of the flames, but the smoke was choking. "Out the back," Marcus bellowed. "Now!" They ran through the hallway, the ledgers heavy in Harrington's hands. Clara supported between two of the rescuers, Eliza half dragged by her sisters. Behind them came the crackle of flames and the colonel's hoarse curses echoing like a curse on the air. The house's great white columns loomed ahead in the night. The shift was almost imperceptible, but Harrington felt it. Eliza's refusal had cracked something in the room that had seemed immovable. In that breath of hesitation, Marcus acted, throwing himself at the nearest overseer despite his injuries. The study exploded into chaos. Harrington lunged at another, grappling for his weapon, as the abolitionists surged up from their knees, fighting with the desperation of men who knew they would not get another chance. The crack of a rifle shattered the air. One overseer went down screaming, clutching his leg. His gun skittered across the floor. Harrington snatched it up and swung it toward the colonel. Enough, he roared the word like a thunderclap. The room froze, overseers backing off with wary glances. For the first time, Harrington saw it in the colonel's pale eyes, not rage, not arrogance, but fear. "Eliza," Harrington said, never lowering the rifle. "Bring your sisters." She vanished, and moments later returned with Caroline and Margaret, both pale and shaking, but resolute. "Tell him," Eliza urged. Caroline's voice trembled but held. "We found Mother Constance's diary. We know everything, how we were born, who our mother was, what you did to her." Margaret spoke next, her words sharp as broken glass. "We know about the babies in the cemetery. 17 graves, Father. 17 children you killed." The colonel's composure crumbled. "You fools. I gave you everything: education, comfort, purpose. I could have treated you as slaves. Instead, I raised you as daughters. I gave your children a future." Eliza's reply was quiet but devastating. "You gave us a prison. And you dared to call it love." Marcus moved swiftly, binding the disarmed overseers with rope, while Harrington kept the rifle leveled. "We're leaving," Harrington said. "All of us. The women, the children, and we're taking the ledgers." The colonel's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You'll never make it off this land. Cartwright will have warrants waiting. Every sheriff in Louisiana will be hunting you," perhaps Harrington answered. "But we'll have your ledgers. We'll have your daughter's testimony. We'll have graves full of murdered infants. Even if the courts refuse, the world will know your name for what it truly is, a curse." For a long, taut moment, the two men stared at one another across the ruined study. Then Constance Crane stepped into the doorway, candlelight soft on her worn face. "It's over, Thaddeus," she said gently. "Let them go." The colonel whirled on her. You planned this." She stood unflinching. "I tried to help them days ago. Tonight I opened the nursery. The children are already being moved to the boats. Clara is with them. Your work is finished. And I am glad." With a strangled cry, the colonel lunged, but Harrington stepped between them, rifle raised. "Touch her," he said coldly, "and I will kill you where you stand." The evacuation took the rest of the night. 9 children carried from the basement nursery, Eliza and her sisters supported, down the halls, Clara directing the removal of ledgers and documents that would damn the colonel and his allies. The abolitionists moved with practiced urgency, loading boats at the dock while the sky lightened over the Mississippi. At dawn, Harrington stood for a final moment on the riverbank, watching the white columns of Bellevue gleam against the morning sky, beautiful and terrible. Inside, Colonel Crane sat bound and gagged in his own study, left to be discovered by those who would remain. Constance had chosen to stay behind, calm in her decision to face whatever came. The boats shoved off, carrying with them survivors' children and the evidence of unspeakable crimes. Harrington knew the road ahead would be perilous. The conspiracy ran deep, and the colonel's allies were powerful. But for the first time since stepping onto Bellevue's soil, he felt the faint pulse of possibility. The scandal broke slowly, then all at once. Harrington carried the ledgers north, placing them in the hands of abolitionist publishers in New York, and within a week, the story spread like fire. Excerpts filled newspapers across the North, the grotesque details too precise and too well documented to be dismissed as propaganda. 3 generations of forced breeding, 17 murdered infants. A conspiracy reaching into Louisiana's most respected families. The shock was immediate. The outrage unstoppable. In the South, the response was just as swift and predictable. Editors in New Orleans and Baton Rouge thundered that the documents were forgeries. Judge Cartwright himself issued a statement calling the evidence fabricated. Colonel Thaddeus Crane, through his attorneys, denied every accusation and filed suits for slander against papers that dared to print the story. But the damage was done. Bellevue's carefully spun network began to collapse. Prominent planters hurried to distance themselves from Crane. The 3 girls who had been placed in wealthy households were quietly removed, their origins suddenly a liability. Rumors swirled when 2 planters connected to the program died within months, one in a hunting accident, the other from a mysterious illness, feeding speculation. They had been silenced before they could talk. Eliza, Caroline, and Margaret were taken to a safe house in Philadelphia, where for the first time in their lives they were free to make choices of their own. The Abolitionist Society provided money, tutors, and guidance as they began the painful work of building new identities and imagining futures that had never seemed possible. The 9 children from the nursery were placed with families throughout Pennsylvania and New York, given new names and new lives far removed from the shadow of Bellevue. Clara survived only 6 months beyond the escape. She died quietly in her bed, her handwritten journal resting on the table beside her. For 15 years, she had borne witness in silence. Now her words lived in the archives of the American Anti-Slavery Society, paired with the colonel's own ledgers as evidence of the system's most chilling extremes. Dr. Samuel Harrington never returned to Louisiana. His license was revoked by the state medical board, and criminal charges were filed against him for theft and conspiracy, rendering him a fugitive in the South. He settled in Philadelphia, working in charity hospitals and tending to those who moved northward along the Underground Railroad. He never married, never fully healed from what he had seen at Bellevue, but he worked until his death in 1867, 2 years after the end of slavery. Colonel Thaddeus Crane, shielded by wealth and allies, was never indicted. Louisiana authorities refused to investigate, citing insufficient evidence and lack of jurisdiction. He lived out his final years in the decaying grandeur of Bellevue. Abandoned by allies, despised by his family, a broken man clinging to the ruins of his legacy. He died in 1852, and the plantation was sold off in parcels, its columns still gleaming white against the river, its history too dark to ever be fully washed away. This is an absolutely chilling and powerful close. It ties the whole narrative together in a way that feels like both a historical reconstruction and a haunting cautionary tale. The pacing you've built is excellent. It moves from the immediate aftermath to the ripple effects across decades to the final fade into obscurity and memory. It feels authentic to the voice of a true crime or historical documentary channel. A few thoughts on what works best here. 1. The generational perspective. Carrying the story of Eliza Caroline and Margaret forward into the post-Civil War years makes the narrative feel lived in and real. Their different paths, resilience, contribution, trauma mirror how survivors process horrors differently. That human detail grounds the broader conspiracy. 2. The vanishing evidence. The choice to let the cemetery be destroyed and the documents buried in archives adds weight. It reflects how easily history silences uncomfortable truths and makes the audience feel like they're learning about something almost lost forever. 3. The modern resonance. Ending with the present-day swamp reclaiming Bellevue, the moss, the unmarked graves, this gives it a haunting cinematic quality. The question you pose to the audience, do you believe something like this could have really happened, is a perfect hook pulling them out of the story and into reflection. 4. The channel call to action. It blends naturally here, because the story is framed as history that may never be fully proven. Asking viewers to weigh in and continue the conversation feels authentic instead of tacked on. If I were polishing for maximum engagement on YouTube, I'd suggest one tiny tweak to the very last beat. Leave the audience with a single, unforgettable image. For example, and somewhere beneath the roots and vines of the Louisiana swamp lie 17 tiny graves. No markers, no names. Just silence. A silence that still demands to be heard.